the good the Savior has given to the world has been communicated through this book.
Now, we're not ready to hand over the GOAT title just yet, because Lincoln's legacy is just as legendary in its own right. Get this. On Lincoln's deathbed, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton offered an epitaph. He said, "Now he belongs to the ages."
Hold up, I'm dead too?
Lincoln embodied a way of thinking that not only shaped our country, but the entire world. His life shows us that the unity of a nation and the dignity of its people is something that should be protected and preserved, but not one at the expense of the other. Those two principles, unity and dignity, go hand in hand. And I think that's a lesson that we can all afford to remember today. Just really inspiring. Did I just pick the GOAT?
Okay, do you really think this man is qualified to be?
No! I don't! We're the best! It should have been us!
Should have been us, that's what I'm saying. This entire time I've been saying that. Hey,
Yeah.
you're a pretty good general.
I'll tell you, you're a pretty decent president.
Thanks.
I can't do this. Let's just let him flip for it.
And the West, well, too often it believes the lies because comprehending such evil is hard. And when people can't understand it, they misplace the blame.
This battle isn't just about Israel. This is a threat to the entire free world.
Because when the truth dies, freedom dies with it.
So stand with Israel.
On this episode of The Story Behind the Story, Matt Crowd sits down with Mike Rowe to talk about his past, the way I heard it, built on what we choose to remember. In 1998, Joseph Ellis was teaching history at Mount Holyoke College. Professor Ellis was best known as an expert on our founding fathers, with a Pulitzer Prize under his belt for American Sphinx, his seminal biography on Thomas Jefferson. Today, though, he was talking about his service in Vietnam as a platoon commander with the 101st Airborne. "What was it like over there?" asked one student. "Were you scared?" asked another. "Well, of course I was scared," he said. "Mostly, I was scared for the men whose lives would be affected by my decisions." Professor Ellis went on to describe the unique terrors of jungle combat, crawling through the mud, slogging through the rice paddies. He wove the history of the war into the history of his own experience, including his decision to become a war protester after he came back from Vietnam and march side by side with America's greatest civil rights leaders. As always, his stories kept his students on the edge of their seats. "Always remember," he told them, "the past is what we choose to forget. History is what we choose to remember." Later that afternoon, Professor Ellis returned to his office to finish an article on Thomas Jefferson. The esteemed scientific journal, Nature, had completed a DNA inquiry that shed new light on a 200-year-old rumor that alleged our third president had fathered children with his teenaged slave girl, Sally Hemings. According to Nature, those allegations were no longer rumor. A recent DNA inquiry had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Thomas Jefferson had in fact fathered at least one child with his slave, and Professor Ellis had been invited to offer a little historical context about the kind of man Thomas Jefferson really was, and what we might learn as a society from this unfortunate revelation. And so he did. Professor Ellis wrote a piece that portrayed Thomas Jefferson as a human being, a flawed human being, with urges and desires he routinely indulged. The day after Professor Ellis's article was published, the story swept the nation. No less than 223 newspapers picked, and the headlines were shocking. Overnight, Thomas Jefferson was branded a sexual predator, a child molester, a rapist, and a 19th century deadbeat dad. After 200 years, the science was finally settled, and for 2 months in 1998, our founding fathers' depravity was headline news. Soon, there were calls to remove his statues from the public square, calls to remove the nickel from circulation, calls to rewrite millions of textbooks, rename streets, rename hospitals, rename schools, and dismantle the Jefferson Memorial. Calls continue to this day. Looking back at that unprecedented media blitz, it seems that Professor Ellis was correct. History is not the past. It's the past we choose to remember. And today, thanks to modern science, everyone knows that Thomas Jefferson used a young slave girl to satisfy his sexual appetites. Even in Monticello, his ancestral home, visitors are reminded that Hemmings had but 6 children with Thomas Jefferson. But if that's what we choose about our third president, it might be worth remembering a few other things that accompanied his fall from grace. It might be worth remembering, for instance, that Joseph Ellis was not really a platoon leader with 101st Airborne. He'd never even been in combat. He'd never even been to Vietnam. He made all that up. Nor is there any record of him marching with civil rights leaders or protesting the war that he had lied about fighting in. When his lies were discovered, the professor issued a public apology, but Mount Holyoke College had no choice but to... Now, does that mean Joseph Ellis lied to Thomas Jefferson? But it might be worth remembering that just a few weeks after his article was published, the scientists at Nature had to issue an apology of their own. Turns out, the DNA evidence they had relied upon was inconclusive. In other words, the science wasn't settled, and Nature had to retract their article. Now, does that mean the scientists at Nature published a study they knew to be incorrect? No. But it might be worth remembering that the rest of the media did. Of those 223 newspapers that reported on the original article, only one tried to set the record straight. Most ignored the retraction entirely. In fact, many in the media doubled down on the conclusions drawn in the original story and created hours of new content that reinforced the claims against Jefferson. Frontline produced a special. CBS did a docu-series. A major motion picture was released. And dozens of books were written about the moral turpitude of Thomas Jefferson, all based on scientific evidence in an article that had been retracted. Now, does that mean the mainstream media was trying to distract Americans from some story, keeping a 200-year-old rumor in the headlines for months on end? No. But it might be worth remembering that back in 1998, Thomas wasn't the only Jefferson with his DNA in the headlines. There was another man whose reputation was crumbling before our eyes. Another Jefferson whose DNA had somehow gotten all over so the young he hadn't had sex. That led to his impeachment. The same lie that would have led to but for a retracted accusation that led hundreds of reporters and pundits to compare the alleged conduct of our third president with the actual conduct of our 42nd. Just look at Thomas Jefferson, they told us. If a man who rapes his 13-year-old slave can stay on Mount Rushmore, well then surely a man who lies under oath about having sex with his 24-year-old intern can stay in the White House. Further proof that a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has time to put its pants on. Or in this case, a president.
Good evening. This afternoon,
A president named William Jefferson Clinton.
I testified before the Office of Independent Counsel and the grand jury.
Anyway, that's the way I heard it.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know.
Whoa.
I know. That's I deviated somewhat from the traditional format with this one, but I can explain.
Please.
I'm sorry we're out of time. So here's what happened with this story.
Okay.
And let me just say at the outset, I've got no axe to grind with Professor Ellis, who's an extraordinary writer and an esteemed historian, and I'm not trying to throw Bill Clinton under the bus. But I got pretty far down the road writing a story based on probably 10 different sources that I read that describe the process whereby the intrepid Sally Hemings negotiated with her lover, Thomas Jefferson, the freedom for her children. If in fact the status quo remained as it was, she knew that her kids would be free, and Jefferson agreed to this accommodation. And I found this story everywhere. And so I wrote it. And I was here with you. And we went up to the house, and I talked to Tom Newman. And I told him about this story, and he said, that's going to be a good one. But you know, we have a friend who has a slightly different take on it. And he told me about Dave Barton and a book called The Jefferson Lies. So I read it. Well, this is annoying, right? This is a good book, and it's well researched. In fact, there are more footnotes in the book than there is book. You know, and you know Dave. I don't. I know of him. Anyhow, I read this book, and in the book is the essence of this story, the Nature article, the situation with Professor Ellis, the situation in '98 when all of this hit the fan, when all of this was headline news. And it just made me think, you know, the reputation of a man, you spend your whole life doing your best. And one thing, right? That happens in real time all the time. But to have it happen to a man who's been dead a couple of centuries, the man who wrote our Declaration, a great man whose efforts gave us this country, it felt to me like a cheap shot. And it made me angry, Matt, because I was part of, here I was, I had written a story, I was this close, you know, to hopping on this bandwagon.
Wow.
Now, having said all that, I wasn't there. I'm not Dave Barton, and I'm not Professor Ellis. I just read the stuff that I read, and I wrote what I wrote because at that time, the statues were coming down, and cancel culture was alive and well, and we were just living in the present through the lens of the past, and we were rewriting our history before we just completely ripped Rushmore in half. Let's get the rest of the story.
These three
Spirit, without which we would have independence, no union, no constitution, and no republic.
Everyone needs to vote for that guy.
Washington gave the United States a rock-solid start. He instituted the presidential cabinet and set the tone for all future presidencies. Washington himself said that he was merely a tool in the hand of Providence, aka God, and he allowed God to use him to establish an incredible legacy. A legacy that has impacted every president who has ever served this nation in this role.
While we are contending for our own liberty, we should be very conscious not to violate the rights of conscience in others, ever considering that God alone is the judge of the hearts of men.
With his